He knew where he wanted to position himself in the spectrum of issues. He had a well-articulated sense of what the people wanted to hear.
I'm calling on behalf of Richard Nixon for president.
By 1968, one hope was shared by all Americans, that the war in Vietnam would end soon. Richard Nixon's ads plainly hinted that he was the man to do it.
If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past.
What he was implying in the '68 campaign, I've got a secret plan on how we're going to win this war. What he really had was a realization that this war has been lost. And he realized it at the same instant in time that Lyndon Johnson realized it, and that was in the Tet Offensive of 1968. Nixon's plan wasn't to win the war. Nixon's plan was to end the war by withdrawal and by building up the ARVN, what came to be called the Vietnamization program.
Nixon will win the 26 electoral votes of Illinois.
And it all worked.
Win election to the presidency of the United States.
Richard Nixon won narrowly.
Nixon had counted all the beans. He knew what he had to do in the Electoral College, which states he had to win. And he sat in an easy chair and watched television, had his yellow pad, had his totals on the yellow pad. He was very taciturn, very undemonstrative. Finally, the results became clear late, and it was time for him then to go down and thank the troops with his family. It was as if you had flicked a switch. It was no longer quiet, no longer contemplative. He went into this brightly lit ballroom, and it was smiles and his arm around his family, and the public persona was advanced.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
But his failure to carry the House and Senate would make the efforts to implement his policies anything but fun.
The President of the United States.
A President of the United States.
Life in the White House quickly fell into a routine dictated by Richard Nixon's very particular style of leadership.
He intentionally created compartments in the White House. It would not confide everything to everybody. He had people pretty well figured out. He would treat me far differently than he treated Colson.
Kissinger, he would play like a fine instrument, fine musical instrument.
I recall when I first dealt with him, he was very formal, and it was almost as if we were on a set and we were playing president. He didn't seem to be very comfortable with people as a general rule, though.
One remembers the famous picture of Nixon walking on the beach, you know, in California, wearing black shoes and black socks, and so most of us would be out there in a bathing suit. I think that Nixon was a kind of a dour, somber figure, you know. He was, I think, a loner.
That got to be a perceived problem. The image makers in the White House decided the president should have a friend. And so they researched it and discovered there was a man named Johnson who Nixon had lived next door to. So Bob Haldeman recruited him for the White House staff. And he was designated the president's friend. And Haldeman went in and said, "Good news, Mr. President. We have your friend here, Mr. Johnson." And Nixon said, "Johnson?" He said, "You remember, you used to live next door?" He said, "Oh, that fella." He said, "I never really cared for him." So he never saw him.
As with any president, it was through the press that America came to know Richard Nixon. But his years away from power had hardly mellowed his feelings about them.
By the time Nixon came to the White House in 1968, with rare exceptions, he regarded the press as if not a monolithic enemy, at least 95% opposed to him.
The press gave Richard Nixon very little credit for anything. during the time he was president. And it was very frustrating. It was particularly true of the Washington press and the New York press.
One great irony of the Nixon administration is that it's remembered as conservative domestically. The opposite was often true.
He created the Environmental Protection Agency. He created the Occupational Safety and Health Program. He was the first person to put teeth into affirmative action with the Philadelphia Plan. He passed and put in place pension reform, all of ERISA. He changed the direction of Native American policy. He poured money into black colleges. He created the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. He was a very activist Republican president.
There are a lot of things that happened under Nixon that people don't think of Nixon in association with. But they didn't happen necessarily because Nixon wanted them to. They happened because of the reality of the American political system. The most striking example here is the imposition of wage and price controls. Very un-Republican, very un-Nixonian thing to do, but he did it. He did it to stave off Congress doing it in an even more drastic fashion than he did it in. He had no choice in the thing.
Whatever his policies, whenever he had something to tell America, Richard Nixon always preferred to get his message out directly. The moon landing, a payoff from the Kennedy era, was one example.
And Walter Cronkite's talking about the Sea of Tranquility. So I pick up the phone, and I call the White House and say, let me talk to the president. And I get through, and I say, he's talking about the Sea of Tranquility. Why don't you use that in your statement when they call you, or when you talk to the astronauts, and use tranquility and apply it to your generation of peace. Good idea, he said.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And as you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth.
And then the phone rings. And it's Nixon to say, you know, that worked. And had we just done this and this, it would have been even better.
The ongoing horror of Vietnam was inevitably the page-one story of the early Nixon years. It was soon clear that the war was not going to end soon or easily with the new administration. As protests grew against its handling of the war, the White House attempted an end run around the stranglehold the anti-war voices held on the nightly news.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action.
Effort of the silent majority was to gain support for the presidency despite the masses that you would see on television and read in the newspapers who would come in and really literally had the government under siege. A lot of things could have happened which didn't happen because people remained calm and all the way through. But he had to have public support. This gave people an avenue to write wires or to write letters or to come out vocally.
It was the incursion of American troops into Cambodia in April of 1970, presented not as an escalation, but as yet another way to shorten the war, that really revived the protests.
He was going in and getting out. And it might have worked, even in terms of public opinion, had it not been for Kent State. Remember that picture of that woman rising and screaming? That made it look as if Nixon had turned against the young people in the country, when of course he had not.
But even as the war dragged on, there were other happier moments back home. One of his daughters, Julie, had married Dwight Eisenhower's grandson, David, just before the inauguration. That marriage of two dynasties had been nearly 20 years in the making. As Richard Nixon approached the end of his first term, he would undertake startling initiatives that would change the world and bring him, briefly, to the highest point of his long career, even as darker events would begin to lead to the end of his presidency.